Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be going over some simple steps that we can take to secure SSHD. Most of them are going to be in the SSHD config file, and then we're going to do one change on the UFW firewall. So let's go ahead and jump in. So first off, when we're messing around with the SSHD configuration file, you always run the chance of locking yourself out. So it's good practice to have two SSH sessions open. You'll have one that you open and close to test the changes, and one that you just leave open in the background in case something goes wrong. You can log in with that one so you don't get locked out. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So we're going to SSH into the test server. And I'm logged in, and we're going to open up a second connection. And we're just going to leave that there in case something happens and we get locked out of it. All right, let's continue. So in order to make changes to the SSHD configuration file, you have to have sudo privileges or be logged in as root. It's located in etc ssh sshd_config. So let's go ahead and go through this and see what we can change in order to tighten up our configuration. And just like anything with security, whenever you make a change, you gain something and you lose something. So I'll try to go over that now. All right, so the first thing we're going to need to do is create some SSH keys and get them copied over to the server because we'll have to have that set up before we can move on with the configuration. So let's back out of here, exit out of the server, and get those keys created. We'll create the keys with the SSH keygen command. And then by default, it'll create a 2048-bit RSA key and drop it in the .ssh folder. I'm not going to give it a password, but if this was a production server, you'd probably want to. All right, those are done. So let's go ahead and get it copied over to the server with the SSH copy ID command. And then I for the identity file, and that's going to be located in the tilde.ssh. And then that's going to be the ID rsa.pub. You want to copy over the public key, not the private key. And then the user and the IP address of the server. Enter your password. And it looks like it was copied over. So let's go ahead and try that out and see if we can log in with that key. So we're going to SSH the identity file, .ssh, then ID RSA. Now we're going to use the private key, the user, and the IP address of the server. Hey, it likes this. All right, let's go ahead and configure the configuration file. So we need sudo bam etc ssh sshd. All right, let's go to the top of the file. So starting at the top, the first thing we can do is we can change the port that the server is running on. This typically isn't needed, and some people consider it security through obscurity, but it does have some usefulness. If this is on an internet-facing interface, it can cut down on the automated scans and the alerts that you get. A lot of the automated scans will only look on port 22, so if you run it on a non-default port, you will get a lot less alerts in your SIM, which is kind of nice, but it does add overhead because if it's not running on the default port, then you need to declare that every time you connect, or you can set it up in your local SSH config file. Since this is an internal server, I'm not going to change it. My personal preference is if it's an internal server, I leave it as it is. If it is exposed to the internet, then I'll change it. Next one down that we need to look at is the address family. And this means it'll use both IPv4 and IPv6. Just like anything security, if you're not using it, you should turn it off. In this case, I'm not using IPv6. So I'm going to set it to only use IPv4. The host keys, sometimes you do need to change those. You can regenerate them with the SSH keygen command, and then you just have to say where they're at, like you see here, etc SSH host RSA key. The only reason you'd really need to change those is if it's an old server that hasn't been updated in a while and it's using, for example, like a 1024-bit RSA key that would not be PCI DSS compliant. In that case, you'd have to update it or you will fail your scan. The next one we want to look at, logging level is important if this is a production server. If it's not a production server, you can set it to whatever you want, really. But for production, info is probably fine. Logging grace time is another one I like to change. This dictates how long a user can stay connected without successfully authenticating before they get disconnected by the server. Having a high logging grace time could increase your risk of denial of service attacks, where you get a lot of connections and they just sit there and don't do anything and just use up system resources. So I'll drop this down to about 1 minute. The next one we want to look at that's very important is the permit root login. And right now it's set to prohibit password, which means you can't log in with a password as root. You have to log in with an SSH key. That is still too permissive. So we are going to set this to no and just deny all root login. Strict mode set to yes. That's a default and you want to leave it as yes. What that does is if you have a user and their configuration files are set to be rolled readable or rolled writable, sorry, it won't allow you to log in. So always leave that to yes. Max authentication tries, again, 6 is too many. We are going to set this to 3. Max sessions is how many connections you can have open concurrently. You definitely want this more than 1, at least 2, because even in this example, we have 2 connections open. So if we take a look here, we do have this one, W, and you can see that this is me, and we have 2 connections open. So it does come in handy to have more than 1. The next one, public key authentication, you have to have that at yes. Don't change it to no or you'll lock yourself out. If you're only using public key authentication, we can leave those as is. Password authentication, since we just tested and we made sure that we could log in with our SSH key, we can now change password authentication to no, which means you can only log into the server using an SSH key. So that really reduces the chances of someone gaining access through brute force. Another one we want to look at is the use PAM, and this is set to yes by default. If you look up SSHD hardening tutorials on the internet, you'll see a lot of them that say change this to no. The reason they recommend changing this to no is because when it's set to yes, SSHD is going to run as a privileged user. And if you change it to no, you can run it as an unprivileged user. But that does come with some drawbacks, like I said. The main one is if your server is connected to a Windows domain and you're authenticating that way, you have to have PAN active or you're not going to be able to log in. Another one is if you're using, say, the Google Authenticator, you have to have PAM active. In this case, the server will be connected to a Windows domain, so we're going to leave that on. Coming down here to allow TCP forwarding and X11 forwarding, if we're not using it, we need to turn it off. So we're going to set that to no. We're going to set that to no. And then also, oops, we're going to set that to no. For the agent forwarding, print message of the day. The next one we're interested in is the client alive interval and the client alive max count. What we're going to do here is set this to 300, which is 5 minutes. It's 300 seconds. And so if we go 300 seconds, basically 3 times, 15 minutes, it's going to disconnect our session. So if we're idle for 15 minutes, we'll be disconnected. And most security policies, they do dictate 15 minutes, so that should be fine. Banner is another one that we're going to want to turn on, especially if this is a production environment. And normally the one that we use is going to be the Odysee issue, and we will have to update that because by default that's going to show the operating system version that we're using, so we'll update that in a moment. And down here, we do need to add a couple more. So the first one is going to be allow users plural. Since I am the only user, I'm going to add myself. If you had other users, you would add other users here. The other one I like to turn off is the Debian banner, just so we don't disclose more information than we need to. So let's go ahead and right quit that. And before we do that, we need to update the Odysee issue. So let's delete that. And we will go ** authorized users only **, give a little white space below it. Quit out of there, and now we can restart SSHD. System. Restart SSHD. All right, that's restarted. So now that it's restarted, you see that we still have both connections open. Let's go ahead and log out of one of them and log back in and see if we can connect. Hey, it let us back in, so we didn't make any mistakes. That's excellent. And let's actually do that one more time so we can see the banner. And there's our banner, authorized users only. All right, so the last change that we can make to harden our SSHD, this is not in the configuration file, it's actually with UFW, and I believe it's installed by default. This is a fresh install of Ubuntu Server 20.04, so we can check the status of it with sudo UFW status, and it's inactive. So what we're going to do is we're going to sudo UFW, and we are going to add the limit SSH. New rule is added, so we will enable that now. And this part is important because if you mess it up, it will disconnect both. So you want to make sure you get that right, but this is right. And there it is. It's going to disrupt our connection. And there it is. And what limit does as opposed to allow is it limits the amount of connections per second that are allowed to connect to that port. So if we actually take a look at the rule, so if we W, and it is in user rules, and if we come down here, we should be able to see it. Let's zoom in on that. And here it is. So our limit TCP 20. So you can see that it allows 6 hits every 30 seconds. So if you wanted to change that, you could lower it. 6 is probably safe. And what this will do is it'll make it harder for attackers to brute force it because it'll only allow 6 TCP connections every 30 seconds. So it does put a rate limit on that. And those are our simple steps that we can take to harden our SSHD config and our firewall. Thank you.